Good morning, everyone. It's amazing to see so many people, but I think we still have enough chairs. It's wonderful to see you all. I'm Gilda Vargas Adams. I am the president of the Academy for a few more minutes. The last time we spoke, we were in Cincinnati, taking our transformative journey at the 72nd AACPDM annual meeting. And today we are here in sunny Anaheim, ready for what promises to be the best AACPDM meeting yet. I welcome you all here if this is your first meeting or your 51st meeting, Al, somewhere around that number. If it's your first, I hope you have the time of your life, and I hope you decide to join our academy by the time this meeting is over. You won't find a more passionate or collegial group of people anywhere. And if you are here for the first time, you don't know our academy well yet, this is our mission and vision, things that we really keep at the forefront of everything we do. Many of you are very familiar and you know about our strategic plan, the 6 pillars that we have used to guide what we do, including things that happen at this meeting. I want to spend just a couple minutes highlighting a few key activities over the last year. In the realm of service delivery and quality improvement, when we did strategic planning, our membership told us that they wanted accessible and useful guidance, and the Care Pathways group has been hard at work. You can click on that logo on the first page of our website. There are 5 care pathways up and running. The Central Hypotone one just came live this week. I encourage you to take a look at it. Really useful material there. There are 4 more in development, and a beautiful development too of a greater focus on methodology as we build these care pathways. So that is a testament to the work of all of our members to share broadly ways that we can improve the care that we deliver. In the realm of organizational excellence, we also heard that there's a great interest in special interest groups. And so in the last year, the board solicited applications for our trial balloon SIGs. There are 2 that have started up and are in this kind of beta test mode. You can go to their very first meetings here in Anaheim for complex care or adults and aging. Stay tuned as we wade a little further into those waters over the coming year and see what happens for this academy and SIGs. And then in partnership and collaboration, no surprise, this year has been about an international focus. We are delighted to be partnering with the International Alliance of Academies of Childhood Disability as we bring together this combined meeting, the first one we've ever done. We were able to offer more international scholarships, and the slides that run between sessions, you can see that long, long list of people and countries that are represented here, which is really exciting. And we're really delighted to bring this meeting to you in collaboration with the IAACD. This is a landmark meeting in many ways, the biggest in at least 50 years, and it is really fabulous to be here with you as it comes to fruition. I also want to take the opportunity to truly thank you. It has been amazing to spend a year as the president of this academy. I want to thank our members, our attendees, our board of directors, the committees, our staff, everyone who has made my tenure as president one of the most rewarding experiences of my career. It has truly been an honor and a privilege. And it is an honor and a privilege that I'm delighted to extend to the person who will be your next AACPDM president, Dr. Mauricio Delgado. I got more. I get to say more. It's my prerogative. And Mauricio was kind enough to share with me some incriminating photos. You all know Mauricio, I suspect, because he's been around the AACPDM for some time and he's served in so many capacities. He's familiar to us all as the guy who quietly comes in and does a bunch of work and then smiles and sits back. But we can go back a little further. he was even more charming as a toddler. And I didn't know, but he was the oldest of 8 children. I suspect this photo is around the time that he was in college in Guadalajara, when he was clearly a fashion icon. Or maybe it's when he was in medical school in Monterey. I don't know, but he did then move on to train in child neurology. He was in Ottawa, and how adorable is this photo with his daughter? That career path, began in Mexico. I don't think that time in Chile, Canada agreed with him completely, because he quickly retreated to Texas and has been firmly ensconced at Texas Scottish Rite Hospital for 34 years now. I understand that that's a good thing, because there's still enough space to store all of the greeting cards he's saved from every patient and staff member and colleague, so that he can remember all those important moments. Mauricio's also been a key collaborator in so many important initiatives. This is just one of many. Who knows all the mementos he saved from that. I did learn that he still has the very first vial of Botox he ever used for a patient. So maybe he'll bring that relic out sometime and share it with us. But truly, Mauricio's an amazing clinician, certainly a consummate researcher and collaborator, and a builder and nurturer in so many ways. Here he is with the winning scientific poster from our meeting 3 years ago. So many trainees in child neurology and beyond who have benefited from his mentorship. I learned some other interesting things. Do you know that he has run an amazing program to bring neurology residents from Mexico up to Texas Scottish Rite for observerships, and over the years, the number of individuals who have had the benefit of this training has exceeded 250. And here he is with his marvelous wife, Maria. Here's another tidbit. Yes, they have a gorgeous family and a wonderful life together, but do you know nearly 10 years ago that they founded a scholarship fund to permit Latino students to attend Catholic schools in Dallas, and that program has already provided that education to over 130 children? But their greatest partnership, oh yeah, absolutely. Their 4 kids and 2 dogs. This photo's a little bit older, because this is Mauricio's family now. What a wonderful demonstration of a happy family, and a wonderful moment for me to introduce your next AACPDM president, Dr. Mauricio Delgado. I believe this is the moment for the ceremonial passing of the gavel, which we forgot to do last year. So I would like everyone to take note.
Thank you. Nice reflex hammer. Thank you, Gilda. You are so kind, and you have done such an outstanding job leading this academy. I'm so proud of you, and we are very grateful to you. And we have a little, small token of our appreciation there, which is a plaque with a gavel, so you will never, forget what you did, and a nice certificate. Thank you. Thank you. It's such a great honor and a humbling experience to follow the steps of so many wonderful people that I have admired over the years. To tell you the truth, I'm a little bit scared. Actually, I'm very scared to be the president. Because I know being president is a job that can wear you out. See what happened to the presidents of this country, after they finish their term, they all look old, tired, and not too happy. It seems that the same thing can happen to presidents of the Academy. I have not even started. The picture on the left is me 18 months ago, before we start planning this meeting, and the one on the right is just a few weeks ago. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, and obviously Gilda looks better than ever, so I don't know how they do it, okay? So congratulations, Gilda. But let me tell you, I don't think this is about me, or about Gilda, or even about you or the Academy. This is about our collective effort to advance the knowledge and skills that are necessary to provide the best care we can possibly provide to these patients that come to us looking for hope, hope for a brighter future, hope for closing the gap, hope to find a cure for childhood onset disabilities. This is what it's all about. That's what's bringing us all here together. So I want to welcome you. I want to welcome you to the challenge to improve our knowledge, a knowledge without borders. We want to invite you to get out of the box, get out of your comfort zone, and open your mind to new information, new experiences, new way of thinking. It is here where you will probably find more questions and answers. It is here where you will be challenged. It is here where together we can and must tear down the walls that keep us apart, not only geographically, but intellectually, because knowledge belongs to humanity, and we have a responsibility to discover and share the truth with the world. So we owe it to our patients, and we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to humanity. So with this frame of mind and determination, I welcome you to the 73rd AACPDM annual meeting and the second triennial IAACD meeting. I'm very grateful for your presence. I know that for many of you, it was not easy to get here, that you traveled from far away and that you made a lot of sacrifices to get here. So now that you are here, I hope you will take advantage of the tremendous learning opportunities that this meeting offers you. This is perhaps the Academy meeting with the largest international presence. We have broken a record. We have conference participants from 49 countries and from 6 different continents. I hope you all feel at home and embrace this as your meeting. It doesn't matter where you come from, and it doesn't matter if you are an Academy member or not. You are a very important person to us, and we expect you to embrace this meeting and feel at home, and that you renew the energy to continue that journey for those that have put their trust on you. So we have prepared a very comprehensive and copious program with lots of opportunities to be exposed to the latest knowledge from exome, genome, all the way to telerehabilitation medicine. The program has a very solid structure using the, sorry, I'm going the wrong way, using the ICF framework to organize the content of the sessions and posters. The conference will offer you a lot of courses, breakfast seminars, instructional general sessions and focus on current controversies, etc. So you have a challenge. Where do you go? I was telling somebody, you probably feel like a mosquito in a nudist camp. You don't know where to go. Too much. But that's a good challenge to have. That's a good challenge to have. And I hope that you choose well and take advantage of the opportunity. So thank you to all of you who are here presenting and sharing your research work, your clinical experience, and your knowledge. Finally, I want to thank all those people who generously gave their time and talent to put this meeting together. Without them, this meeting would not be possible. I will start first with our office staff, which are listed on that slide. They are amazing people, hardworking people. They go above and beyond their duty, and I really think they deserve a round of applause. The breadth and depth of the scientific program is the result of the hard and diligent work of a scientific program committee, and for the first time, of an international scientific advisory board. So we had representation from a lot of you and all your countries to put this program together. And for that, I'm very grateful. Thank you for your assistance and commitment to quality. I was very fortunate to have a scientific committee co-chaired by 3 outstanding individuals that I call mis tres amigos. These 3 individuals started working on this year's program a long time ago, over a year ago. So I would like to invite them to come to the stage so you can meet them and help me recognize their outstanding job in putting this conference together. Dr. Veronica Schiariti, Dr. Francisco Valencia, and Dr. Diane Damiano representing the IAACD. Who starts? You want to start? You want to start with that?
Okay, so you are all here. We've been working more than a year. I think we started in June last year. So we have a couple of announcements. I am in charge of, asking you to download the app and use the app. This is a very busy meeting, and I think the app is your best friend. So you can go to the app and select the program and select the sessions that you want to attend. You click on the star and you build your own schedule for the meeting. One thing is that you can access all these parallel sessions and you don't need a ticket. I know that you register during the registration, but you are free to go to any session and I want to thank you because many of you are the presenter. We have a record number of abstracts, so you are like to blame for this busy program, not us. So thank you for submitting all the wonderful proposals and abstracts. And one thing, we have a record number of posters, and so you have posters for Thursday and then a new set on Friday. So don't miss the posters today. Many people work so hard to present those posters. So please go like anytime to check the posters. Use the app.
So what I was told to remind you about, we're doing things a little different this year with the tickets. The reason we asked you to register for different sessions was because we needed to gauge room sizes as best we could. If you did not register for a symposium or a session and you don't have a ticket, there probably will be room for you, but please be respectful. So sort of hang back, let the room fill up. When it gets closer, if there's still room for you, by all means, join the session. So just be respectful of each other. Thank you.
I have a couple of slides. Sorry about this. But Mauricio last night said, we want you on the podium and I want you to do a couple of things. So first of all, I want to welcome you. As Mauricio has already done, this is a fantastic opportunity for all of us. The other thing is to say thank you. And again, we have to thank the leadership of the American Academy, the International Alliance, and the Allied Academies. We want to thank the advisory board on behalf of the co-chairs, because a lot of people, as you saw in the previous slides, helped us out with all the work, and all the reviewers that helped us out as well. We want to thank the Home Office, as Mauricio said, and again, we want to help the vendors, the sponsors, and also there's the non-for-profit organizations that are going to be represented here and in the poster room. So please stop by and say hi to them. And then finally, to all the contributors and to all the attendees. You are what make the meeting, and it's been a pleasure and an honor for us to be able to provide this for you. So we hope that you enjoy. And then finally, we want you to have fun. So we hope that the meeting, the objectives are, number one, that you have fun. Number two is that you renew your friendships, make new friends, new networks, and then hopefully you'll take something home that will be of use to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You can take the picture while I keep going, because we're... Yeah, go ahead, take your picture there. So I also want to thank this group of orthopedic surgeons from Tucson, because they were responsible for the mariachi that we had last night. Wasn't that great? Francisco had something to do with that. Thank you so much, okay? He didn't want me to mention his name, but I think we should. All right, so let's move on with the program. As we already mentioned, we are so excited to be celebrating the second IAACD meeting here in this town. As you probably know, our academy, together with the European Academy of Childhood Disability and the Australasian Academy of CP and Developmental Medicine, together formed this international alliance in 2014. So we're very proud of being an integral part of this international effort that has the ultimate aim to improve the health and well-being of those people with childhood onset disabilities. So I will now ask the first president of the International Alliance, Professor Hans Forsberg, to come forward and tell us more about what's happening with this amazing effort that you happen to lead. Thank you, Hans, for being here.
Yep. Thank you, Mauricio, for inviting me. And I will tell you a bit about our alliance, but first I actually want to welcome you all to the second international conference of the International Alliance of Academies of Childhood Disability. I also want to thank the American Academy for hosting us and organizing such a fantastic meeting. In particular, I want to thank the very new president of the Academy, who has been leading this effort, and the program committee, the directors, Francesco Valencia, Veronica Chiriati, and who actually have been the ordinary AACPDM, but then Diane Damiano has also been the third program director, and being in particular responsible from our alliance to have an international agenda. And I also want to thank all of you who have participated in the scientific committees, the local one, but also we have had an international committee, all to try now to make this a true international meeting. And I think when we saw here the introduction, we are on the way. So, last time I stand exactly here at an opening ceremony at AACPDM was 5 years ago in San Diego. Then a couple of months before that, we had signed a memorandum of understanding at the European Academy annual meeting in Vienna. That was 2014. And before that, the chairmen of the three academies, the American, I should say North American, the European, and those Australasian academies, had met at NIH with one of the founders of the Alliance, Diane Damiano, and we had written the Memorandum of Understanding, which is a beginning. But it was not really the beginning, because this is the beginning. 2013, we at the AACPDM, we had a workshop where many of you participated about evidence-based medicine. That was when we tried to influence Russia and the East to become more modernized. And that's at this meeting with one of the other founders, Bob Armstrong, we actually created the idea, how can we now promote the well-being for children with disabilities. So you see, we were working very quickly there. During the first year, we had the memorandum, it was signed. Then it took a long time. At that time, it was Unni who was the president here, and we could eventually sign the Constitution 2017 at the meeting in Montreal. So what does the Constitution say? We could say there are three parts. The first one is that we should build a network of academies. Through this network, we shall enhance local capacity by knowledge sharing. So that's the way we are doing it. The ultimate goal is what Mauricio actually already said, that is to improve children's health and well-being. This is what it's all about. We will not talk so much about the last part. We will mainly talk now how we build these networks. So the first part will be, I will briefly go through the Constitution, the new academies we have, the communication platform we have got, the international conferences, and then at the very end a bit about the activities we are doing. This is kind of a boring picture, it's an organogram, but it tells you how we are going now to cover the world. At the top, you have multiple academies. Each of these academies will elect delegates, so we should have a general council. So that will be the body of power where you can then influence and govern the alliance. This council will elect an executive committee with a president, secretary, treasurer, and 6 members, 1 from each continent, to really secure coverage. The work will really be done in the subcommittees. And at the moment, you see, we have subcommittees for education and training, for best clinical practice, a membership committee, finance committee, communication committee, and conference plan committee. So what I will show you at the end is actually the work very much of these committees. So we already heard we had the 3 founding academies. Now we have two more academies. The first one is the Mexican, and actually, Gila, I think you should have added that. The mentor, really, of the Mexican Academy has been Mauricio. But they have been very, very efficient at creating and setting up their academy. Yesterday, we approved the Indian Academy. So we have now 2 full member academies. In addition, we have applications from the East African or Eastern African, I learned this morning, from the Latin American, from the Chinese, and from the Southern African. That means we have 4 academies who are in place and who have started the application process. In addition, we are now in contact with colleagues in Korea and in Pakistan. So that means we have double-digit numbers now in this alliance. Now, we should have had, my goal was actually, we should have the first governing council here at Anaheim. But since we do not have academies from each continent, that was not possible. So still we have the steering group, and still the steering group is from the founding academies. But in all other committees, we have representations from all the provisional ones. So look here, what an impressive development. So that was East and that was Latin American. And there is, that's the Mexican, and we have the Chinese and the Indian, and the Eastern African and the South African. Somehow now my circles is not on the right. Sorry for that. That happened in the translation. But it's very impressive. So we have all these academies. But if you look at the top, we have a rather boring logotype. Don't you think so? So one of the committees, the communication committee, they have now been working. We need to have a communicative platform. We need to have a logo. They sent out now to all academies, and we got in 20 applications. They picked 5 of them, and eventually we have one winner. And the prize is a free ticket and fee to come to this meeting. So who was the winner? Let's start with the logo. Now they have already shown it for you, but this is the way it looks. Oh, sorry. I was too quick here. We will come back to the logo, just wait. I will come back to that. So this is actually now the Mexican Academy. We have the Eastern African Academy. We have the Latin American Academy. We have a delegation at the Stockholm meeting by a Chinese delegation who are now applying to become one of the members. We have the Indian, approved yesterday. We have now talking with the Pakistani, and we have the Southern. Actually, this meeting was only last year, and they have already filed their application. So this is a network. Now you can see it. And now you can see the boring. We redo it. You see the boring logo. So this is what it looks like. So I hope you will see this logo many, many times, and that you will also be engaged and use this logo when you're working. So if you look on the text here, I really like how they define it. So it's a playful logo, worldwide element, children at the center, adult lifting a child. It represents the future of the world in the hands of children, whatever disability or background. No limits. By making the adult in the logo part of the letter forms, we felt this made the IAACD integral in the support of children. I think it's very well formulated. I really like it, so I'm so happy. So who are the winners? So this was a team from Children's Trust in UK. So with Tony Hunt, Ellie Hunt, Melanie Barrow, and Rachel Beresford Ward. And there should be one here, because you have a free ticket as a prize. So Melanie, where are you? Can you stand up? Can you stand up? Give her an applause. Yeah. Thank you. So that was the beginning. Now we have a logo. Now we need to start communicating. And we just heard, how do we communicate? Not with a lot of books. You need a web platform. So, and there we are very thankful. So our communication committee and our Global Professional Education Committee, in collaboration with Ken Child and with Peter Rosenbaum and John Gorter, we have now set up this wonderful website. And the one who has done the job, that is Daniela Granovac. I have met you. She's here. Give her an applause. So it's launched today, so you can all go in there. And this we really hope now should be the meeting point. You have some where you can read about concepts, principles, the fundamentals for the work we are doing. You can have help for diagnosis, for intervention and other things, and there should be a knowledge hub. And this is really what we want help now from everybody to contribute, so we can build up a lot of knowledge which should be easy, accessible for everyone. Even if you are far out in the bush, you can use your iPhone and you can access this. So this is what we really are striving for. And it's a very easy address, IAACD.net, net as in the global net, work we are trying to. So, this is the second international meeting, and it actually follows a series of what's called the ICPC. That was the International Cerebral Palsy Conferences, and you see starting in Quebec, in Oulu in Finland, Sydney, Pisa, and Stockholm. So these are the legacy, our ICPC meetings, and now we are coming here. But this is not the ICPC. So if you see, what we did in Stockholm was that we combined the ICPC with the first international meeting hosted now by the AACD. And actually we got 1,500. This is just now to be a bit competitive. So we are waiting now for a lot of on-site registrations so we can break the record. And hopefully we will do so. So this is the second. We have already decided that the third meeting will be in Australia. Some know where in Australia. And if you want to know where, you have to be here on Saturday, because then it will be announced. Because this is the way we'll be doing it. When we have a meeting, the next 3 years from will be there. And how do we then? So in the future, we have now set up a conference planning committee that will set up the rules. How do you make a bid? How do we approve? And how do we then decide where should the meeting? And that is 2025. So all of you from all these 48 countries, wasn't it? Please come in with bids for 2025. So this is just to say, so we are already up and running. We have the Global Professional Education Committee who has done a lot of training programs, starting in Georgia and in Paris, and now we'll have several other of these in India, East Africa, Mexico, and Poland. They are also developing models of training, and what I already showed, they are responsible now for the knowledge hub, how we can get teaching material on the hub. We have recently set up a committee to promote the development of evidence-based practice recommendations. And that had their first meeting actually yesterday. So that should be then through this network we have, but also through collaboration with other institutions. And already we have ongoing collaboration with the UNICEF and the WHO. Those who are interested, there will be a symposium just following this. We have in our mission one goal: promote needs-driven research. Here we want now to set up a new committee which should have both a more public health but also a more clinical approach. So here we really want you who are interested in taking part. Either you are senior and can give advice, or if you want to be starting different research projects in your, take contact with us. And now we have the website we can go for. I also want to say we have a very good support and collaboration with the DMCN journal, and they just launched this virtual issue, Childhood Disability Across the World, which is a collection of articles from the last years. And interestingly there were not so many research articles which really highlight the importance now that we can get going with this research committee. We have also written a small editorial coming out here about the international collaborative work we have with UNICEF and WHO. So, with this, I again thank the American Academy, the program committee, for setting up this meeting, Knowledge Without Border, which I think is very, very appropriate to have here. And I really hope there should be no barriers, that there should be interaction all over, and that you who really want to see, that you want to take part in this global mission, you should take contact with us, either here at the meeting or via the website, because the ultimate goal is now to improve the health and well-being for children with disability all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. That's amazing work that you and the rest of the team have done over the last 4 or 5 years. Amazing. So, yeah.
But just to tell, it's not just me. We are a team. I have not mentioned everybody, but there is a lot of us working with this. So I'm just telling you what we have done.
So I would like to just have maybe a couple of minutes. If you have any questions, you could come to the microphone, or you could ask your question through the app. And since this is the opportunity to ask Professor Forsberg anything you want about this effort that you already heard about. So any questions? Looking at the app to see if anyone is. Okay, here's a question.
Alain Châtelain from France. A question to Hans. Are you envisage involving parents in these organizations, because they are involved in research projects in many places, and of course I think they have something to say in the organization, in the goals, and in the projects that such an organization could put to work.
Yes, thank you, Alain. A very important question. Yes, we are. We have not really been very effective yet, but now, for example, when we are discussing to setting up the research committee, we will definitely have it needs-driven. That means we need to have families there to tell us what are the needs. We also we have not yet really, because we have had enough setting this up, but I take your note and we will include parents or caregivers in this.
Any other question?
I have a question. Actually, more of just a statement. Hans, this is Bernadette Gaelic, and I'm just reminding everyone that tomorrow morning from 7 to 8, we have a Global Professional Education Committee presentation on more of what we do. So if you'd like to join us tomorrow morning from 7 to 8, that's Symposium 20. So thank you very much.
Yes, good there. That's good. Okay.
Very good. Thank you so much. So now let me introduce you to the next speaker. He's a very special person and a good friend of mine. And he has a heart of the size of Texas. And for some of you who don't know how Texas is like, it's big. So he's an amazing human being with vision and passion and integrity, and who has served this academy over the years so well. So Dr. Al Scherzer is clinical professor of pediatrics emeritus at Weill Cornell Medical College. The first time he came to an academy meeting was in 1966, and many of you were not born yet. And he has been an active member since 1967. That is over half a century. He founded and chaired the International Affairs and Advocacy Committees. He was elected president of the Academy in 1986 and received the Lifetime Achievement Award in 2011. He has served the Academy as historian for the last 10 years. So nobody would dispute that Al is perfectly qualified to speak about the Academy's history. Some people may ask, why is it important to speak about history? And I don't know if this is working. So I would like to quote an American poet and novelist, Robert Penn Warren, who said, "History cannot give us a program for the future, but it can give us a fuller understanding of ourselves and of our common humanity so that we can better face the future." So we have a bright future. We'd like to know more about the Academy history. Please help me welcome to the stage Dr. Al Scherzer.
Thank you, Maurizio. And you see what happens if you live long enough. You know, that's a big first. This is a historic occasion. I mean, obviously, Hans's point is very clear, but I summed that point up as, this is history. And you and I, we're making history here today. Well, it took the Academy 73 years to get to this point today. And I want to share with you a little about the journey along the way. Okay. By 1945, at the end of World War II, rehabilitation medicine had become well known. That's important. It's only since 1945. And, oh, what's happening? Oh, the National Society for Crippled Children and Adults, which is well known as the Easter Seal Society, had a CP division by then, and they decided to organize a cerebral palsy medical advisory council, the CPMAC, in Chicago. And that council deliberated over the following year, corresponded, and they agreed to form and establish the American Academy for Cerebral Palsy, the AACP, specifically as a discussion group, for medical specialists certified with the total limit to be 100. Oh, okay, good, thanks. And now let's look at the perpetrators of this committee and the council. On the left is Maya Pearlstein from Chicago, a pediatrician, a clinician who was very interested in the field and actually organized a brain registry which has been taken over by the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. He was the liaison, really, to the Easter Seal group because he was in Chicago and he benefited from some of the financial support. Temple Fay, who was next to him, was a well-known neurologist and neurosurgeon from Philadelphia, and we'll hear more about him. He was very pivotal in this. Winthrop Phelps, the dean, an orthopedic surgeon who was early interested in cerebral palsy and established a center in Baltimore, which is now part of the Kennedy Krieger Institute. Next to him is the oldest member, Bronson Crothers, who set up a CP clinic at Harvard and was at one time the teacher of Winthrop Phelps, who was doing his orthopedic training there. Earl Carlson, the youngest in the group, was a young man with athetoid cerebral palsy who went to Yale University School of Medicine, where he met the professor of orthopedics at that time, who was Winthrop Phelps. Imagine that. And Phelps became his mentor. So these connections are all there. And finally, George Deaver, a professor of rehabilitation medicine, was the first to establish a center for children at the Institute for Rehabilitation Medicine in New York. Now, as it turns out, the vision that they had for their academy never really happened. It turned into something else, and very largely because of the increasing numbers of therapists since World War II and therapies and schools of therapy, as well as orthopedics, which had a big impact. And both of these affected membership and the annual meeting. Let's talk a minute about the membership. Some dark secrets will be coming out about this illustrious academy. As it started out, it was for board-certified physicians only and limited to 100. But by 1954, because of demands, that limit was lifted. And because of the numbers of physicians or doctors who really wanted to be part of the academy, in 1964, I can't read it, I'm sorry, 1957, the membership were now changed to any MD, whether or not you had a board certification, and if you had a doctorate, you were a doc. So all docs were then accepted. So they took care of the docs, okay. That was the first thing. But then, what to do with these pesky therapists? This is really a pain. What are we going to do with these people? They want to come in. They're going to ruin the academy. They're going to take away its medical focus. It was a real argument that went around very seriously. So by 1964, there was a proposal for membership of therapists. It failed, totally, in 1964. By 1973, they tried to come up with something in between, like you could be an associate, your dues would be less, but you had no voting privileges. They wouldn't go for it. And finally, 20 years later, we had a uniform fellowship for all members. And incidentally, that year, we had the highest membership ever, over 1,600. Well, a cohesive group and a multi-specialty group formed and is strong and has never looked back at those naysayers. It was tough, and there was a lot of debate, a long debate, and here we are. Now, as far as the annual meeting, another big difference from what started, the meetings were, I can't even say informal. Anyone who wanted to at the beginning got up and spoke as long as they wanted. What they spoke about often was anecdotal or case studies. There was certainly no data of any sort, and whatever the discussion. However, there was some discomfort with this, and by 1955, the annual meeting in Memphis was the first one with a formal agenda. That's 1955, a formal agenda with restrictions on how much the discussion could be, etc. And at that time, instructional courses were included in the meeting. Before that, it was pure discussion, nothing. So that was a big change. By 1966, when I came on the scene, and which I remember quite well, this was an absolute blowout, absolute. What happened was all of the preceding therapies and schools of therapy that had developed were brought together in one place. And it was known, the meeting was also the first to have a theme, systems of therapy, and it was often referred to as the battle of the therapies. I was talking to Annie Kay several times of the last few days because this was the meeting with the highest attendance ever, 1,400. And we have exceeded that here today, she told me. Well, you have to, this is what This is what the program looked like, the program booklet. You could put it in your pocket, which was very convenient for guys like me. And it contained whatever was going on. But I wish you would, what's going on here? Oh, sorry. It's not working. If I get it back? Oh. Visualize if you will. Close your eyes if you need to. A sporting event. A sporting event with booze and cheers and sidewalks at the 1966 Academy. There was great competition for which one of these therapies was going to be the predominant one. This is not an exaggeration. This is how serious. And that 1400 representation showed how intense the interest was. This is the list of the demonstrators, discussers: Phelps, Deaver, Crothers. Incidentally, just Crothers, I just want to mention that for a second. Crothers got into cerebral palsy because he had a German gymnast on his staff who told him that all these children need is conditioning. And it seems to me at that time that was a pretty modern thing to say. But and there was Bobath, who was very new at that time, of course went on to NDT with reflex behavior. I want to just focus in a moment on the last one. And this is where one of our founders, Temple Fay, comes in. He elaborated a theory which was known as ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. I see some heads shaking. Maybe you remember this. The idea was that the infant had to repeat evolution. And so you had to crawl like a fish, get up like a reptile, and eventually walk like a man. That was the conception. And two therapists took that on and called it patterning. Anybody here know of that? Do anybody have a few? Yes. Well, it still exists, by the way. I can give you some stories about that. But patterning required every hour somebody to come, put the child belly down on something and move him like a fish and eventually get him up. And whole communities got volunteers to do this. It was a nationwide love of this procedure, which cost a lot of money, by the way, because the parents had to go to Philadelphia for instruction and training. Well, there was a great deal of unhappiness about this within the Academy. Perlstein eventually got a committee to come together and write about it. The committee had a paper published in the Journal of American Medical Association, and we were sued. We were sued. Not the Academy, by the way, but the person who wrote that paper, which is another story. It was a very tough time for the Academy, financially very difficult. We had to support the litigation. Eventually, over a number of years, it was thrown out. But in the course of that, it hurt the Academy. Nevertheless, we survived. And we have as strong an annual meeting, as you can see, as we ever had. But of course, the annual meeting is only one part of the Academy. I bring to your attention one of the early things that was done was to somehow or other clarify both the definition and classification of CP, which is total turmoil, confusion, mixed up. And we did come through a classification by Dr. Menier, which was both anatomical and qualitative. And of course, by 1997, the GMFCS just burst through like a meteor, I think, and overwhelmed the research capabilities and our understanding. The last and most formal definition came in at the beginning of, in 2005, by a number of well-known people in CP, but of course, it does not include what we know today about the genomics or even the possibility of, as you will hear later by Dr. Getz, of some kind of spectrum into which CP forms. So that remains to be seen, and we'll see what the definition looks like. Again, I think I missed, okay. Community education was big. Regional education courses started in '72. We have e-courses. We've had many different kinds of regional, other kind of courses. And in 1993, the Family Forum was initiated as at each annual meeting to gather whatever families we could and provide an educational focus. It's now known as the Community Forum. CB Research got its start through the efforts of the United Cerebral Palsy Research and Education Foundation. This is a private group that started providing grants, and that has now been taken over by many other types of sources. In 2017, the Academy, in conjunction with the National Institute for Neurology, Disease and Stroke, has established, so important, the common data elements, CDEs, for all cerebral palsy studies. So there's a standardization among CP studies. Publications include our newsletter, which was initiated by Pearlstein, and is currently under review as to whether its existence online should continue. Our esteemed Red Journal came in 1963. We have had treatment outcomes and systematic reviews, and now care pathway summaries of evidence of care. Well, in 1976, we finally saw the light, and the AACP became the AACPDM, and includes, of course, all childhood onset developmental disabilities. And more recently, we have established a community council under organizational review as to exactly how it fits and where it will be part of the scene. But the point is that it will represent, and does represent, the interests of consumers and the community. And finally, I cannot add anything really to Hans's point. He stole my slide, thank you. And I can only say that as a development of the Academy, along that journey, this has been a wonderful thing, and we thank everybody involved with that. Well, there they are. In 1946 and today, they could never have envisioned anything like what you see today. They could never understand in any way that the mission of the Academy, not just a discussion, but global. And it's so we have come an extremely long way. And this is a slide. I can't show you anything on this one. I have no way of putting down in words what's here. I would call it maybe atmosphere. There's an atmosphere about the Academy. Conviviality, the sharing, participation, learning, lifelong friendships for anyone, no matter who you are and what you are. And so that's why I say, this is my Academy. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Don't leave, Al. Don't leave. Wait. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for, first of all, putting 73 years of history into 20 minutes. That's fantastic job.
This is the Maurizio's 70-20 lecture. 70 years in 20 minutes.
Well, second is to thank you for all these years of unquestionable commitment and dedication to the Academy, and congratulate you for ascending to the Academy Historian Emeritus.
Ooh. Wow.
And yeah. And I want to welcome Dr. Bill Oppenheim, who is probably around here. I said, Bill, and you stand up so people can. Bill is over there. Okay, Bill is going to be our new historian, and we're very, very grateful for your service. Thank you, Bill. Moreover, we want to announce a new initiative for this Academy starting in 2020. Each annual meeting will feature an Al Scherzer historical moment.
Oh.
This brief presentation will occur during a plenary session and provide an opportunity for our members and attendees to learn about the history of our Academy or about the world of childhood onset disability in the past. We are grateful to you, Al, and we will be remembering you.
I'm not
forever.
gone yet, not gone yet.
No, I know you are not. So this is a nice token of our appreciation. Thank you, Al, for being here with us. Okay, so he wants to. Thank you, Al. All right, so we need to keep going, and I'm very excited to introduce you to the next speaker. He will be talking about something that is extremely important for all of us. This whole conference has followed the ICF framework. So Dr. Rune Simonsen will be speaking about this. He's Professor of Education and Senior Fellow of the Frank Porter Graham Child Department Institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His academic preparation includes the disciplines of psychology, special education, public health, converging on the study of developmental characteristics of children and youth with chronic conditions and disabilities. His teaching and research interests focus on the assessment and classification of development, functioning, and disability of children and the role of environments related to children's health, education, and well-being. He has engaged in consultation on child development and disability with the United Nations agencies, as well as with many countries around the world. He has served as chair of the World Health Organization work group to develop the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health version of children and youth, and served on the World Health Organization Committee to revise the Diagnosis and Intellectual Developmental Disorder, ICD-11. So please help me welcome Professor Simonsen, who will talk about ICF-CY, added value for developmental practice. Here he is, okay.
Well, I want to thank the leadership of the Academy and the International Academy as well, and the organizers of this conference for this tremendous privilege of meeting with you today. And I'm really impressed with the opportunity to hear the great leaders who have contributed to the history of this Academy. I remember as a student reading the works of Scherzer, Professor Forsberg, and others, and it's an incredible experience and opportunity to be here today. I will take the opportunity to talk about the ICF-CY and with the topic of added value. Since my work with the WHO and chairing the version for children and youth, it has been my goal to continue to try to advocate for its use by all who are involved in services for children with disabilities. Where's my, is this one right here? Okay. So, I will give you a brief overview of the ICFCY with particular reference to the contribution it can make to the work that all of us are involved with. It's a little bit awkward, I should say, to be here because I had counted on the fact that the parent of the adult version was to speak before me. And I thought that he would provide a background and on the ICF itself, and then I could just say, well, here's the child version. But I know that many, many of you are familiar with the ICFCY, and so I will proceed with the comments that I had prepared for today. Well, what is the ICFCY? Well, prior to 2001, the classification of children was really based on diagnostic entities. And in the 1980s, of course, we had the first emergence of a non-diagnostic classification, the ICIDH. But with the revision of that product in 2001, the classification of functioning disability and health was produced. I and many of my colleagues, some of who may be here today, were part of that effort for the ICF. But as a person with the deep commitment to children, I kept saying, but where are the child content? Where are the issues that relate to children? And apparently, I guess they just felt like we were nagging too much. So in 2001, with the publication of the ICF, they gave us a commission to develop the children's version. Since their publication, of course, many, many studies have been carried out, much application has been made, and those efforts are reflected in the journals, many of which you will all publish in. Okay. So why was it developed? Well, the nature of developmental processes were not sufficiently covered in the ICF. Obviously, that was from the perspective of the children's group, but I think that that evidence was borne out in the development of the measures. Development and disability are parallel processes, and so in order for early intervention to be initiated, we had to have the content reflect that in the ICFCY. The child is a moving target. What are the developmental parameters of many of the functions and structures of the body that need to be captured? And finally, this work, I will want to give credence to CDC that was really responsible for the support that made the ICFCY possible. Well, what kind of codes are added? I can't give you all of them. There are hundreds and hundreds of them. But just to give you an idea, what we're trying to capture was what are those things that characterize a child. And I want to emphasize the fact that we did not enter child items. We entered items that were precursors of adult function and what was present in the child but would not be reflected in an adult version. So managing the child's behavior, how do you reflect the fact that the child is engaging in behavioral or self-regulation? So these were the kinds of items that we prepared. Dispositions and interpersonal functions. This sounds like a very strange word, but actually we were trying to get at the idea of temperament. Temperament has had a long and wonderful history in psychiatry, looking at the goodness of fit of the child and the caregiver. And so this item had to be fit into places where, quite frankly, I should say, where there were unused codes. So we were not at liberty to just put codes wherever we wanted to. They had to be put where there was an open space. Economic life, that's a very strange heading, but this is in the very last section of the activities and participation codes, where economic life became the place where the only available code that we could put an item having to do with engagement and play. But still, play is the work of the child, so it's not too bad an idea, although we usually don't pay children to work. Well, this is an awkward moment. I have to give a second disclosure. Some of you know, and others have asked me, why can't I access the ICF-CY on the WHO website? Well, somewhere in 2012, the FDRG, which is the Functional and Disability Related Group, which meets every year on several occasions, made a determination that in order to emphasize the developmental nature of the ICF itself and to have a lifespan classification, that the content of the ICF-CY would be merged with the ICF. That work is still going on. I don't have firsthand knowledge or experience with that process, but it is my belief that even though the child is returning to the parent, that is the parent version, the child's identity will be preserved in the ICF as we go forward. And that's the reason that I will continue my presentation today rather than saying, well, that's it. So what is the added value? Well, I think the added value is, by definition, the codes. As a universal language of childhood disability, in any language of the world, a single word conveys meaning. A combination of words integrates meaning into a concept. In the ICF-CY, a single code documents the nature and level of impairment, limitation, or restriction. A profile of codes documents disability. So, in order to keep on time, what is the added value of the ICF that we can identify today? If we think about the ICF-CY code as the unit of added value, we can look at it in terms of modeling disability, measurement, parent involvement, treatment planning, documentation of outcome, code and core sets, documenting rights, and policy. And I will illustrate a few of those points with you, drawing on the literature that has defined the use of the ICF-CY. The ICF-CY provides this dimensional framework of being, that is the body functions and body structure. That's who the child is. What they are doing in the activities and participation domain, and the context in which being and doing is occurring. The universal language of alphanumeric codes then provides us this way of constructing meaning of a given child's disability. Well, what does the ICF do in terms of an added value? Well, an added value is that it helps us to model disability, childhood disability in particular, and drawing on parent and assigned severity qualifiers to selected codes. Rationalysis was carried out, generating a measure which is statistically derived to indicate what is the nature of disability and what is the continuum of severity. This variable was found very much to reflect the intra-individual differences of children, as well as to differentiate the differences of groups by traditional categories. Another added value is to measure participation. Participation is the core contribution, I think many of us feel, of the ICF and the ICF-CY. That is, all of us are committed to the idea that we are helping to restore a child to full life, to participate in all the activities that all others are engaged in. And in this case, this particular study looked at to what extent is this concept of participation, which was really operationalized in the ICF and the ICF-CY, made well after many of those instruments were developed. The point we're trying to emphasize here, if we look at the 9 chapters of activities and participation, they vary, but particularly community, social life in terms of participation items and activity items. And I think it's important to see that there is a balance of the two, although some chapters have less of participation items than others. What about measuring the environment? The environment is the other major contribution of the ICF and the ICF-CY. Before the ICF-CY, there was no universal global measurement of the environment. And so the introduction of that scale and that domain and the scales within that domain have provided a tremendous resource for documenting the context in which children live their lives and individuals with disabilities live their lives and what the impact of that environment is. When we think about it, everything that we do as professionals is an environmental factor. And in that case, taking that into account helps us to understand not only what may be factors in the child's life that serve as barriers, but also that are there to facilitate. And of course, our treatments, our therapies, our interventions are really definable as facilitators. In these 28 studies by my colleague, this is just an illustration of the fact that to varying degrees, the recognition of the environmental factors, of course, in particular relating to the child, the immediate family, as the major environmental support. Parent involvement is crucial. I think that whatever field that we're working with that has to do with serving children with disabilities, parents have always been at the front, and they have provided the impetus for making things work and to make things change. And in this regard, one of the major contributions of the ICF-CY, the added value, is to engage families in the process of viewing their child's disability from their perspective within the family life and the daily living of the child. And in this case, this study looked at that from the standpoint of what environmental factor codes would be captured. And in this case, the facilitators, which I guess are no surprise to you, of assistive devices, supportive family, friends, and health services, but also barriers, which having to do with not only the most obvious one having to do with the design for children with mobility disabilities, but other things which may not be that obvious, but are there, and we need to recognize them and take them into account as we plan for the interventions for the child. Treatment planning. An analysis of rehabilitation plans for 77 children with cerebral palsy looked at that from the standpoint of translating these needs and functional difficulties into treatment goals. One of the things that was very clear is that the codes and what they represented, that is, what is it they're capturing, was most frequent in the rehabilitation plans, fewer in the treatment goals, and perhaps a little bit worrisome was they were fewest in the match of functional needs with treatment goals. And I think that this is an area that I think the ICF can assist us in identifying and improving the match of needs with treatment goals. Documenting outcomes, a review of the ICF-CY dimensions of intervention goals was done with children with visual impairment across disabilities. This is a record of 289 boys and girls, but the point that I really need to point out here is the developmental representation of different domains of the ICF-CY. As you can see, the representation and the reflection of the codes that were sampled relative to outcomes for the youngest child, those having to do with body functions and structures were the primary, and with much lesser so with the older child. When you look at the activities and participation, of course, by definition, as the child matures, as the child develops, what they do and who they participate with and what they engage in increases, and that's reflected here as well. And then the importance of the environment, that is, what is the environment serving in terms of goals and barriers, facilitators, that shows, again, a corresponding decline with age, to simply reflect again the fact that this child, older child, has more skills, becomes more competent in addressing their daily life. Documenting outcome, this was an interesting study, I just wanted to illustrate it for you. Some researchers in Taiwan looked at hippotherapy. I don't know if they might even be here today, but the important here is to look at what were the codes that might reflect the intervention of a 12-week hippotherapy experience. And we can see here that the changes in the codes having to do with mobility and joint functions, muscle tone functions, involuntary movement reactions, and interestingly, in play. So play might be an esoteric item, but it's not esoteric for children. Added value, corsets. My colleague, Dr. AACPDM, has been very prolific in the development of ICF-CY and ICF codes for children with cerebral palsy. These have been complemented by other corsets for children with ADHD and for ASD by the group coordinated by Bolte in Sweden. But in the broader context, the ICF corset that I think maybe Dr. Bickenbach would have talked about today includes many, many hundreds of ICF corsets pertaining to traditional diagnostic categories within clinical medicine. I think one of the things that we're looking for as we continue is the expansion of what we call code sets, which are not defined by a diagnosis, but rather defined by a developmental period of life or by a setting. So, for example, one of my colleagues in Taiwan developed a code set for early intervention in terms of delay of toddlers and infants. So it's not diagnostic group specific, but rather a phenomenological dimension. We're also looking for increasingly the development of code sets, that is a set of codes that define perhaps children who are served in a certain setting or children who might need certain kinds of supports and services, rather than starting with the confirmation of the diagnosis, start with what are their needs and what are their characteristics. Augmentative and alternative communication is a very important assistive dimension in the work with children with disabilities and cuts across various disability groups. My colleague Charity Rowland and many others have developed a very elaborate code set for children with augmentative and alternative communication needs, which you can see here, which draws on many of the ICF codes from activities and participation, body structures, as well as the environmental factors. Documenting outcome is certainly one of the things that has been central to our concern field as we look for evidence-based practice. I think that one of the contributions of the qualifier is that the qualifier itself becomes an important way to document change. If we look at the idea of the code having to do with regulating behaviors within an interaction, for example, at time 1, which as a time when the child was, they had a severe limitation of restriction. At time 2, which might have been 6 months later or following intervention, that qualifier value has shifted from a 4 to a 1. So the qualifier not only tells us what is this level of severity and problem, but rather what can it reflect the level of change with an intervention. Similarly, because many of the codes in the ICF-CY are hierarchical in nature, it can reflect a change of function from a lower to a higher grade. So undertaking simple task is at the level 2100, and undertaking a more complex task becomes D2102. So the value here is not only in the code itself, but in the qualifier shift. Documenting outcome, here is a study which basically illustrates the application of that in a single case study with a 12-year-old boy with dyskinetic cerebral palsy. And you can see here that these domains of body functions and activities and participation reflected change over a period of treatment. And in terms of documenting outcomes, the ICF-CY, because of its qualifier range and scale, as well as its hierarchical structure of codes, fits very well and can very readily be imposed on common metrics that are used in therapies, psychiatry, psychology, allied health, the so-called goal attainment scaling, which you can simply impose right on there, which works very well. Human rights is a very significant issue, and I think that child rights in particular, I think that all of you are familiar with the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, and the significant role of rights within those processes at any time reflects the concerns and needs of children with disabilities. There are codes in the ICFCY. I think these need to be expanded, but I wanted to illustrate the joint combined use of activities and participation code, which says, is a child deprived of a right, and is there an environmental right that the child has access to? So if we look at access to transportation, the child has a moderate difficulty restriction in the right to move around. And in terms of the barrier that we might identify would be under the Environmental Factors Code, which has to do with access to transportation. Similarly, in many parts of the world, still, in many of the global burden studies of diseases, for example, many children, specifically those with disabilities, do not have a birth certificate. That's the most fundamental identity, and we can measure those things in this process. Documenting child rights, my colleague in South Africa, Dr. Borman, with a colleague carried out a study which is looking at how do parents view the rights that their child has to some of the most fundamental dimensions of life: water, food, own bed, play, friends, and so forth. And you can see here mapping, readily mapping those rights to ICFCY codes. At a policy level, the ICFCY adds value to informing registries. And in this case, a study drew on data for combining cerebral palsy registered across time and looked to see what content was there. And in this case, the analysis of that content was utilizing a developmental code sets that one of my doctoral students developed, and utilized that to indicate to what extent do these CP registries access information that reflects activities, participation, body structures of the child, again with the idea of a common language. So I think with that I will conclude. I thank you for this opportunity to share this information with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simeonson. That was an outstanding lecture. Appreciate it very much. We wish you the best.
It's an environmental factor. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Now we are going to introduce the last speaker for this morning general session. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce this individual, because Professor Joseph Gesch has had an amazing and very impressive career. He's the head of Neurogenetics Research Program at Adelaide Medical School and Channel 7 Children's Research Foundation Chair for the Prevention of Childhood Disability. He and his laboratory has discovered over 200 disease genes. He's pioneering research into the genetics of non-syndromic intellectual disabilities and X-chromosome linked forms, later expanded into childhood onset epilepsies, autisms, and more recently cerebral palsy. He has almost 300 publications, and he has received the acknowledgement for his successful career by becoming or being elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, and the Faculty of Science of the Royal College of Pathologists of Australasia. So please help me welcome Professor Joseph Gesch, who will speak about the genetic basis of cerebral palsy.
Thank you, Mauricio, for your very kind introduction and kind words. Thank you to everyone, scientific committee, for giving me an opportunity. And it's really, I'm definitely humbled and naturally nervous to stand in front of you and in such a distinguished company of speakers you just heard before me. My address to you is going to be slightly different. I'm going to talk to you about perhaps my experience, the way how we came into this group of disorders and how we look at it through the historical perspective and genetic and genomic perspective. I have done much to disclose. A little bit about me, perhaps that may help you to understand how I look at things. I'm originally from Central Europe, from Czechoslovakia, where I've done my studies. I moved to France after, since I finished my PhD, and then into Australia 25 years ago. I always worked at the hospitals. I always had a great passion and motivation to help children with disabilities. So that's where I really built my career. Back in Europe, I work in genetic and prenatal diagnosis of a select few disorders which were known at the time. In France, I participated in human genome mapping, and in Australia, I really found my really passion, and that was really discovering genes, and through that help children and their families. Now, Adelaide, you may or may not know, is also a home of at least 6 Nobel laureates, Howard Florey among one of them, a co-discoverer of penicillin. But also it's a place where major neurodevelopmental disease gene discoveries have been made, and that's like Fragile X syndrome in '91, first epilepsy gene, idiopathic, in 1995, non-syndromic intellectual disabilities as well, our first attempt to understand the etiology of cerebral palsies from the genomic perspective. What we witnessed over the last 30 years, and that's pretty much my career where I entered in 1986, it's quite phenomenal. This is not going to repeat. There were 3 major disruptive technologies or resources which facilitated this, and that is the polymerase chain reaction, which received a Nobel Prize. And that's, for those who may not know, it's a technology which can generate almost visible amounts of DNA from single molecule within a few hours. And that certainly was a turning point. Human genome in about 2000, and of course the so-called next generation sequencing, when we can look at individual genome of an individual with a short space of time. The genomics, it's coming to a bedside. Experience from Australia of acute care genomics for seriously ill children delivers genomics within 72 hours with 51% success rate. It's phenomenal. It's really there. It's at the bedside. So here you can see the pile-up of gene discoveries across this period. So currently we are discovering about 1 gene during a day of a working week every year. So while we are here, there are at least 3 or 4 genes being discovered for Mendelian conditions, and these are the numbers. Before I entered the field, there were about 40. Now we have more than 4,000, and that covers about 6,500 different conditions which are defined by these genetic etiologies. I put this question up because that's what we generally get. I'm paraphrasing questions of our reviewers. What is it that we study, especially when we're studying groups of children with movement disorders and cerebral palsies in particular? So I look at it from the perspective that we study neurodevelopmental disabilities, which have many things in common, and you will see. Our Australian Cerebral Palsy Biobank, it's not very different. And here you can see about 500 plus individuals we captured in our biobank in Adelaide, and that's the work of my colleagues primarily over many years, and in particular Professor Alistair McLennan, who many of you may know. But here you can see that in this group of our individuals with cerebral palsy, we have different kinds. And you can see the numbers which have different comorbidities, including developmental delay or intellectual disability, epilepsies, autisms, or other congenital abnormalities. We're collecting not just information about these individuals, but we're also collecting their DNA, and we're making cell line on each affected individual in these families. Just to give you a brief snapshot of what we have done, and really gratefully acknowledging the support of Cerebral Palsy Alliance and the Tennis Foundation, which facilitated this. We have done pretty much genomic investigation on almost each one of these individuals in our biobank, and different kinds of investigations, whether looking comprehensively on the whole genome, looking at the exomes, which is only 5% of the genome, which is the coding part, the part which generates the proteins. Looking at the epigenetic modifications, we call them in this case methylome, that's one part or type of epigenetic modification, and transcriptomes, that's where we can try to look at how these genes translate into messenger mRNA and proteins. Overall, I guess we now know that genetic etiology we can find in about 1 in 4 cases of our cohort. But this is perhaps a little bit more conservative estimates. Just yesterday we heard from other groups here in the United States, and for example, diagnostic company like GeneDx, where the diagnostic rate is well over 37 up to 50% in certain groups of children with cerebral palsies. But that was a retrospective study, and that group was enriched in individuals with intellectual disability. But this number likely going to rise, but it varies currently from cohort to cohort. Of course, the genetic etiology is not only monogenic. There are these so-called somatic mutations. Sometimes multiple genes can contribute. We look at the polygenic nature of these disorders, and we know that the polygenic nature can explain, for example, in severe intellectual disability, up to 8% of the variants. And of course, the whole idea of doing this investigation in these studies to not to just understand those cases with genetic etiology, but also look at those cases which do not have, or we cannot find genetic etiology, and see what else is at play, which perhaps we can prevent more efficiently by simply knowing these cases to be enriched. This is just one example of a case which really came to our attention, was in our cerebral palsy biobank, and was identified by my colleague Mark Corbett. And it's a patient with a large deletion of a part of the human genome. Now, this is a complicated picture, which for those who may not be used to see these, showed part of the human chromosome, showed the region of about 2 million base pairs, or a little bit less, on specific chromosome 16. And this region is known to have frequent deletions or duplications. So this region is known to be in 3 or 1 copy in different patient populations. It is also known to be this causing mirror phenotype, when deletions of this region cause intellectual disability, high BMI, that's body mass index, and movement disorders, which overlap with cerebral palsies. And duplications, so having 3 copies of this region, predisposed to schizophrenia and low body mass index. Now, our patients with right hemiplegia, born early and with signs of stroke, had deletion of this region, and pretty much fit that general description. And interestingly, by the clinical services was assigned to have cerebral palsy, yet it has one of the most frequent copy number variants neurodevelopmental disorders known to date. What is also interesting, that the penetrance of these disorders is not 100%. So in this case, the deletions have less than 50% penetrance, and duplications even lower. So that means that these disorders can be inherited from unaffected parents to affected children. We still don't know exactly what is driving really the penetrance, so the expressivity, why some individuals can have these genetic abnormalities and do not present with the clinical presentations, and others do. We have some clues, but not across the board. It's a very challenging question to address the level of the penetrance. Because, you know, we have a lot of monozygotic twins, which by definition are genetically identical, yet they are discordant in their phenotype, and we know that the discordance is due to genetic factors, which is kind of, doesn't make sense when one thinks about it, but I could go about it and explain it to you. There are many possible explanations how that can happen. So what is it, what we study? Generally, there are two approaches to identify etiologies across these disorders. One is more phenotype-driven, and that is the one which is more historical. When we took individuals with similar clinical signs, we grouped them, and then we investigated them. So that was always a point of view, and that's, I guess, the allegory of the elephant and a group of blind men who are just trying to identify what kind of animal, or in this case, what kind of neurodevelopmental disability that might be. I also have to remind myself, and perhaps this audience, that not a long time ago, about less than 30 years ago, even my colleagues who were very conscious of genetics of these disabilities were on purpose excluding individuals with cerebral palsy from their genetic studies. The other approach is more genotype driven, so it's agnostic to some extent to a detailed clinical description, and you just throw your genomic technologies, see what you find, and you decide based on your finding. Now, perhaps that's more the approach we are taking. Also, we are not totally, of course, agnostic of the clinical diagnosis, but we perhaps don't go into great detail until we have the test done. So historically, you might be interested to know that the phenotype-driven approach led to discovery about more than 3,000 different Mendelian conditions, while the genotype approach over 2,000, but the genotype-driven approach is more recent, and there is strong opinion, like Michael Bamshut, that the genotype-driven approach ultimately will be the way forward where majority of not all remaining conditions will be identified, because it's going to be the first test, because it's cheaper and easier to do. So we also looked at the way how people use actually definition of cerebral palsy in genetic studies, and this is work of Jess Berry and our student Ryan, when we had done a systematic review of the literature until pretty much August 2019, because we really wanted to know, when people do genetic and genomic studies in cerebral palsy, how they define cerebral palsy and how they follow the latest definition. Now, surprisingly, the bottom line is probably about 1 in 3 studies strictly followed the definition of cerebral palsies, and as such, of course, these cohorts they studied are hard to assign whether they truly represent this group as by the current definition. So only minority of studies report the use of diagnostic, and there's this Surveillance Cerebral Palsy Europe cascade, and where they do report it, they do it incorrectly. So going back, in terms of timing of CP diagnosis, it's of course, there is a challenge, because it takes a while, up to 5 years, before a child is diagnosed with cerebral palsy, and this is data from the Cerebral Palsy Alliance report from this year, or from last year, I should say 2018. And you can see that 50% are described within the first year, and only about 75% up to the age of 2. And Michael Chevelle and the Canadian Cerebral Palsy Register kind of looked at this from the perspective that over this period of time, up to 5 years, some of these patients with cerebral palsy actually may lose the diagnosis of cerebral palsy. And they came up with about 48 such cases from their records, about 1,680. It is great to see that the rates of cerebral palsy are falling, and this is not just a trend in the last year or over the last few years, but it's something which looks fairly consistent. And clearly, and most likely, this is the result of improvements in care. However, from my perspective also, this is the time when we saw this super dramatic increase of knowledge of genetic etiology across these conditions. So the natural question is, or was, whether this drop could be also explained to some extent by early and specific genetic diagnosis in this group. Now, I don't have answers for you for this question because it's not trivial to really test. But I have a couple of, I guess, examples or case reports, and this is one of them, where my colleague, who is a clinical geneticist, he worked in Barcelona, worked in Seattle, and now is working with us in Adelaide, with whom we recently identified patients with scatenin B1 gene mutation. Now, scatenin B1, as we also learned at our meeting of the last 2 days of the International Cerebral Palsy Genomics Consortium, is shaping up the most frequently mutated gene in the group of patients with cerebral palsies. There are probably 25 plus individuals which had a clinical diagnosis of cerebral palsy and have beta-catenin mutation. Now the question was to Louis whether this patient has cerebral palsy. Now Louis thought about it for a while, and then he gave us this answer. Had she been born 10 years ago, she would have likely been diagnosed with cerebral palsy. But she was not labeled with CP as such, but rather non-progressive movement disorder, because that would facilitate the genetic testing. But however, he said that she has a very similar presentations to other cases of scatenin B1 mutations, and that is also cerebral palsy. Now, just to remind you, the scatenin B1 gene implication in this range of disorders which present with movement disorders, and apparently by many clinical services diagnosed as cerebral palsy. This gene has been described first time in 2012 and really kicked into the knowledge in 2015. So this is relatively recent knowledge, and even in our cohort in Adelaide, the patients were recruited before that time. So there was not even a chance to have this patient diagnosed with scatenin B1, even there was a test. So these rates are probably going down because of the improvement in the care. Perhaps some of the CP diagnoses are lost, but it's quite possible that sometimes CP diagnoses are never made. And I guess this perhaps should be a topic for a more rigorous investigation, what is driving really these dropping rates of cerebral palsies, so we better understand where we can do even more. The other reason why we looked at it from that perspective was the example of recategorization of intellectual disability to autism spectrum disorder in the United States. And that's the work of my colleague and collaborator Santosh Girurayan, who is here in Pennsylvania, where we saw a more than 300% increase in the United States of diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And when looked at it in the period of 2000-2010, he found that perhaps the drop or the rise in diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, which is the orange line, it was kind of converging with the blue line, which are the diagnosis of the intellectual disability. But when you look at the combined diagnosis of autism and intellectual disability, which align with the crosses, it's going only slightly up. So here what the paper was trying to say that a lot of these individuals, for different reasons, are re-diagnosed from intellectual disability to autism spectrum disorder. And this was interestingly varied across different states in the United States, perhaps reflecting the state of care and support for individuals with different diagnoses across the neurodevelopmental disease spectrum. We, as a community and members of the International Cerebral Palsy Genomics Consortium, however, we came to a very strong consensus that once a clinical diagnosis is reached for patients like with cerebral palsy, this should not be changed. That diagnosis is based on clinical science and not based on etiology. And that's why we created this umbrella where we really put the clinical diagnosis on the top, and under which sits another umbrella with a different etiologies, and that should be taken. And we perhaps disagree with the terms of mimics or masquerades, which often appear in the journals, which kind of play the attempt to change the clinical diagnosis based on the genetic findings in this group of patients. There are, of course, different genetic etiologies I mentioned that can be monogenic, polygenic, or oligogenic. In autism spectrum disorder, only a small proportion of the cases will be explained by monogenic. The vast majority is likely going to be polygenic, and that may as well be the case for cerebral palsies. Currently, we have between 50 and 250 genes, it depends where you go, which we know are in one way or the other in at least one patient associated with cerebral palsy. The list of genes which are recurrently hit, so there are multiple different or identical genetic variants in a gene in patients with cerebral palsy, it's smaller. But that also is going up simply because the cohorts numbers of these patients are going up. Now, these situations with double umbrella and the number of genes, it's not different. So along these lines, and my experience and my 33 years is not different across intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, and epilepsies in particular. Epilepsies were considered to be one or two genes until, of course, in 90s and early 2000s, many different genes have been discovered. And that field reflected, even renaming the epilepsies to genetic generalized epilepsies, just to allude to the fact that many of them have likely genetic etiology. What is also interesting when you put all these genes together, and these you have are the numbers of some of these genes, there are some genes which can cause multiple disorders. Of course, these are the difficult ones. I mentioned one like catenin B1, which you find it in individuals diagnosed with autism, you find it in individuals diagnosed with epilepsies, you found it in individuals diagnosed with cerebral palsies. Tubulin A1A is another example which sits in the right way. And this is nothing novel, but it is still a concept many of us struggle to really work with, especially when we have to give a prognosis to these individuals after very early diagnosis. So is it going to go this way, or that way, or it's just a different name for the same disorder? But for that, I guess we need to hold on, be a little bit patient, collect a larger group of patients and investigate them properly and look at their natural history to better understand. So we have the prognostic value of these tests and not like the retrospective labeling or knowing the genetic etiology. It is going a little bit slow, but so that's now. Why genetic diagnosis is important? I guess many of you in the audience would know it. This is perhaps one report, one case, which was ascertained rather unusual way, and that's where I was sitting at the airport and I was reading the front page of our newspaper, and I saw that this family was fundraising, and their target was $130,000 to take their child with cerebral palsy to selective dorsal rhizotomy into the United States. I rang up my colleagues and we checked whether we have this family in our register. We didn't. So we approached the family. They were very happy to undergo genetic testing and to see whether there was an other explanation for their child. There was one of two SIPs. This boy had a brother who was perfectly healthy. Now, the clinical geneticist who made an appointment through which we collected the samples had some concern that the condition might be slightly progressive and not purely spastic. And what happened, we did identify a de novo variant in one of the tubulin genes. And of course, this had a very important effect for the family. They didn't go for the surgery. They did contact the donors. They were very most than happy to let them keep the funds. So they have done everything right, and we hope that now, with the right genetic diagnosis, this little boy is in a much better direction in terms of support and precision medicine treatment for him to manage his disability. Another, I guess, importance which I see, but I'm not perhaps that familiar, there is a lot of stem cell therapy happening in cerebral palsies. And a lot of these stem cell therapy is happening using autologous, so the patient own bone marrow cells, for example. Now, you wouldn't even dream to do this, for example, in a patient with Rett syndrome. Why would you take deficient cells in the same genetic abnormality and put them back into the brain of the same patient to repair the malfunctioning brain or the injury? So I guess here there's perhaps an opportunity to really use the genetics and genomics as a stratification tool to identify the cases which are genetic, and perhaps they need to be considered different options for these individuals. It is not just me, but other people notice that cerebral palsy research is perhaps about at the stage where autism research was 10 years ago. It's highly heterogeneous. There is genetic etiology emerging. We need really larger cohorts because we see only the peak of the iceberg. We perhaps investigated 1,000 or 2,000 individuals. We need to investigate 100,000 individuals to really get a better handle on it. We do need sophisticated phenotyping. That has been the clue in epilepsies, and many of you working in that space to understand how many different types of epilepsies are based on very sophisticated phenotyping. Interestingly, cerebral palsies do not overlap with autism only by coincidence. We're finding that by genetic signature, there is perhaps some involvement of the same genetic determinants across these group of disorders, which again brings it to the definition of this group as a spectrum disorder from that perspective. So for many years, and I've seen, and that's why I have been motivated to really jump into this field, that these patients simply were not considered for genetic diagnosis because by definition they suffered an injury at some point during their early development, and that description perhaps flagged that these patients, there was no point, there was no benefit for them to do a genetic testing. Now, I hope that now it's taking from a different perspective. So I would just plead people here in the audience and your colleagues to consider genetic testing where it's appropriate. Perhaps not use it as a blanket for everyone, but please do consider it becoming affordable. It's only a few $100s these days, maybe $1,000 to do these tests. And the risk of findings which we don't want to know about is perhaps more manageable, or this can be prevented rather than the benefit the individuals can get from these tests. It is just another blood test. So I'll come back, and this is my last slide, to really reflect on this. I'm not the first one to try to bring to the attention that cerebral palsy perhaps should be considered as a cerebral palsy spectrum disorder. Michael Chauvel published this not a long time ago, and I very much would support for this audience and the experts in the field to consider this, because that's like in epilepsies, the nomenclature, and it's changing with the changing etiologies. I think this field you work in should be doing approximately the same, because it is important what's in the name, and we heard it from our previous speaker as well. So that's where I will stop, and I will thank you for your kind attention and opportunity to discuss this topic with you.
Thank you, Dr. Gesh. Outstanding. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. The speakers will be at the speaker corner, so if you have any questions, it'll be there for a few minutes. And this ends our first general session. The next general session will be at 2 p.m., so I hope you all come. We'll have a very nice program for you. Thanks.